we're going to move now into an open moment for questions from the audience. I'll ask one just to get us going a little bit. But if you have questions, I invite you to, I think we're going to raise, we have some mics circulating. Is that right? Mics, logistics people? We'll figure out ways to get you mics or if you need to ask your questions while we're figuring that out. I wanted to ask any of the panelists to jump in on the question of whether story is enough, and in particular in connection with platform. A lot of us are storytellers, believe incredibly in story. I believe it, like you said at the end, that it is the most powerful tool we have. But I think the story and the platform might have to fit together in some way. And now, in particular, I'm interested in how do we balance teams where we have multiple kinds of expertise. How are you thinking about putting together your teams? Does everyone need to be a platform person and a storyteller? What do you call those roles? Do we need community organizers in what we're doing? Is it a technologist? And I feel partly that there are so many different terms for these different roles that it's sometimes hard to be an expert in the things we do or know how we fit together with others. So this is a kind of an open question. Anyone want to jump in on this? As you're thinking about the next version of your project, if you were to do this again and really bring new people in, how do you talk about the roles on your teams as you're producing stories or producing platforms? How do those two go together? Anyone want to jump in?
Are these on? Yeah. I think I don't have all the answers, of course, but I have a couple of thoughts based on going through this type of process. I think one component that was important was a central figure who had the big picture in mind, who had the bones of what they thought was important, and rather than starting from a completely blank page, but not having filled in so many of the gaps that the team would not be able to meaningfully contribute to what was produced. So for this particular project, that was me. I had the broad scope and key elements that I thought were important for the story, but really what we created came from the team itself. I also found that it was important not only to have a technologist, but a technologist who understood the significance of the issue we were tackling and had some commitment to it. Even though Jeremy, for instance, hadn't worked around racism, he believed in the problem, thought that it was important to tackle, and even as a technologist had thought about social applications of the tech. I think it would have been a different experience to work with someone who had been deeply grounded in technical elements of VR and hadn't really thought about stories or thought about social applications. So those are just a couple of quick thoughts about components of the team. And last thought is having that team from the very beginning of the process, or very, very early on in the process, and everyone having equal stake in what gets created, not just sort of coming in as a consultant, I think was also important for us.
I'll just pick up on a couple of those things and some of the things actually that Courtney said. I like the framing of transdisciplinary, with the idea that when you come together as a group, you don't just bring your practice and your perspective, but you actually create new perspectives and new practices. And to me, that feels like what she's saying, which is really important. And I guess for me, part of that assemblage of team is privileging curiosity and mutual respect and a sense of mission. And the mutual respect part is like recognizing that we come from different backgrounds and lived experiences and maybe career stages, but not wanting to create a hierarchy within that. And I think the other aspect that I like that you just mentioned is this idea of having some kind of a vision that's concrete enough and developed enough to inspire interest and curiosity and passion, but not so developed that there aren't lots of opportunities to reshape it, recraft it, and embody it in alternative ways. So one of the things that we do generally is we do these salon sessions where as opposed to typical academic practice where you bring a paper and you defend your paper and then we all attack your paper and your methods and you leave kind of slightly bruised and saying, shit, I wish I had known that before I submitted the thing, and we feel like we showed how smart we were, but it wasn't really a great team experience. We invite people to bring a half-baked idea, an unscratched itch, a challenge that they're facing like at the idea stage and say, tell us the thing and let's work on it together, and let's assemble a weird group of people like this room that have all these different practices and perspectives, and let's work on that problem together. And then you leave kind of with some information. We all leave feeling like we contributed to something, and we have done some of that trans work. And I think that those kinds of practices set a stage for genuine participation, for creativity, for experimentation, both with introduction of known practices and also pushing back on those in the context of what the greater ambition is.
Courtney, when you had that slide of all the different disciplines that you worked with, that really resonated with me. And I think sometimes when we're getting a team together, it's pretty clear what everyone can bring to the table. And something that I've found to be really valuable is also asking those folks, what do you need? What are your dependencies? What are your blind spots? And so as someone who writes content, it's easy for me to make a hypothesis or make a guess or use some of the best practices, Annie, that you were talking about and go for it. But at the end of the day, if we're going to really make change, as a content writer, I need to know what the barriers are for our audience, what the incentives are for our audience, what are UX best practices, what are researchers saying, what are young people saying. And so I think that having understanding not only of what everyone on the team can bring, but also what they need to be successful is an important framing as you get started.
All right, we have questions from the audience now. Good. We do have some mics, so I'll call on folks as their hands go up. Yes.
Hi, I wanted to raise some questions about the way the event was framed. There were two specific questions. Jennifer mentioned this word, like-minded, and that combination of words makes me cringe, because what we need exactly is the opposite. And millions of Americans voted for Donald Trump because they were sick and tired of some like-minded people with all the money and power telling them how they should think and how they should act. And Hillary Clinton epitomized somebody who hasn't talked to somebody who disagrees with her, perhaps in several decades. Now, the other issue is Katie said something about
Actually,
a positive. Let me finish.
Okay, it relates to the first one?
Yeah, it's completely. So the idea of we need positive stories. We do need positive stories, but we also need to spend a lot of resources on debunking bogus stories. Because before we used to have sort of this Goebbels, right? The big lie. Now we have a lot of little Goebbels. Every organization has a little Goebbels. They call them director of communications. So all these lies need to be deconstructed. And I think every institution needs to have a commitment to deconstructing its own bogus stories.
So I think the question about how we get beyond the like-mindedness challenge is a really provocative one. Especially, it ties a little into the stories and whether we use certain kinds of stories to bring people together and sometimes other kind of stories to mobilize movements. I think Dewey has talked a lot about publics arise in response to a shared problem, but do we have the right kinds of problems out there that bring people together? Again, turning over, anyone in the panel want to jump in? Yeah.
Hello, what's your name? Tarzan. Faizan. Thank you for the question.
Yeah.
So I would say that in my presentation, I talked about we need to delegitimize white supremacy. Because what you're pointing at from my perspective is that because white supremacy has power and legitimacy, what I mean by that is that there is an authoritarian regime in the right that has created a space to actually tell and propagate stories that are not true to create a political reality. And is powered by the legitimacy and power of white supremacy. So if we understand that first, then what we are attempting to do is not actually tell positive stories. We're trying to tell authentic stories about the actual engagement of people and thread that together with a political ideology that will transform, that'll get you social change. So I would say that, in the Midwest, this is why why our test was about voter turnout in the beginning, but now it's about delegitimizing white supremacy, is because what we saw was that turning people out, engaging in the political system as it is actually not enough if we cannot deconstruct the basis in which what people believe in the system. So like in specifically, there are white folks in the Midwest who have like feel similar issues of isolation, but have a privilege and a history of racialized terror that are like both true. There's like a story and a connection that needs to be made between folks who are feeling isolation, feeling left out, feeling like the system is not for them. We need to tell those stories, and we need to also tackle white supremacy in that thing. So I would say in order to do that, is that we actually have to get storytellers who model that already in the world. And we have to be able to use, because I was sitting here thinking about, the question about tech and how we use it. I'm like, we've been storytellers longer than we've been technologists. We've been storytellers for most of our civilization. So what the right has done is use technology and things to actually tell a story that's not true to the world, in the world that we're moving towards. So what we actually have to do is like deepen our engagement in those stories from folks who are modeling the way the world we want to be to delegitimize white supremacy.
That was an answer that I think built in some ways directly on story, that there's a story answer to this question. I think it's a great question. Does anyone have like a platform answer to that as well? How do we look at whether platforms are also crossing these connections, these divisions that can arise? Because we also have seen platforms further divide people and have people try to tell the right stories, but they're just speaking to people who are still kind of coming from the same space.
I think when we talk about lack of education or stories that are untrue, one of the things that we're always trying to debunk for young people are stories that they're hearing that your voice doesn't matter, your vote doesn't matter, you have no place in this process, because that's what's been told. And one of the things that Annie was talking about that really resonated with me is giving people a place where they can fill in their own story in the way that they can do that in a way that resonates with them. And so one of the things that we say to potential young voters is that you don't have to be informed necessarily about candidates, about politics, about the system, as long as you are informed about your life and your community and the things that are affecting your day-to-day and your friends and your family. That's what makes you informed enough and legitimate enough to go out and cast a vote. And so I think platform-wise, one of the things we were able to do was create localized state-by-state election center where young folks, no matter where they were, could go and find out about their state's laws, the issues on the ballot, candidates, the things that were specifically going to be on their ballot. And I think that by giving folks a way that they could connect with the things happening around them, it was able to fill in that story of like, this matters and your vote matters because, as we talked about, the people who are the most affected are the folks who are the most effective. And so I think we're able to debunk those ideas that their votes don't matter by showing that this is the direct impact you can have on the issues you're facing every day.
Can I just add to that a teeny bit? So and you didn't say it, but you said it before, kind of this idea of young people leading their own voter registration, having their own platforms to do that. To me, that's like saying, it's kind of in the way that we talked about earlier, is here's the grand challenge, and then you get to figure out how to take that on or how to recraft that in a way that's meaningful to you and your community. So that to me feels really empowering, as opposed to saying, here are the talking points, follow these, and you'll win, to say, you figure it out. But there's another, we use platforms in many different ways. And this is, I would say, we're talking about kind of in a positive way. There's also the platforms of like the big technology company platforms, right? Which are, I would say, fundamentally, and some worse than others, are set up to privilege more and more extreme content, to kind of not to help us to reach consensus, to not have productive conversation or interaction or truth-seeking or engage with people with different perspectives from our own, but rather to kind of get more and more extreme in our perspective. And so that, this attitude of what engagement is, clicks or more looking at your phone or whatever, the way that the, kind of surveillance capitalism is set up right now is a disaster. disaster for this kind of stuff. And so it leads to more and more conspiracies and hoaxes and these, sort of divergences between story and fact. To the extent that we understand it in ways that are critical and really problematic. And so I think as we think about platforms in many different ways, it's really important to interrogate what we're talking about and what we can do on each of those, because it's not like we can only engage on one. We have to be aware that it's happening in all these different spaces at the same time.
I would also like to add that if we look at how nefarious actors, people who are not on our side, are using platforms, they're leveraging everything we know from cognitive and social science to build tribes. We just at the university heard from a researcher who followed Russian trolls and found that they went on Facebook and were able to build tribes by activating pride in liberal groups and rage in conservative groups. They're being very intentional with the emotions that they're leveraging in order to build social tribes, which separates us, right? I had a conversation with Christian Picciolini, who is a former white supremacist who's now leading a charge to pull people away from extremism. And he said that extremists are using algorithms to bring people to their website. If someone searches, "Was the Holocaust real?" it will take them to a website that says, "Nope, and why don't you join our movement," right? Or if you think about YouTube and how if you're searching for information on vaccines, people who might be anti-vax are using that platform to share their message. People who are on the other side of these issues are not taking the same proactive strategy. We're kind of reactive sometimes. And I would love to see a world where social change actors are intentional with our emotions, where we're more preventative and more proactive in using these platforms in the same way that these maybe negative actors are using it. Let's use those same tactics for good.
Let's get other questions from the audience. We're starting to get some over here, and it would be great to hear, so we get a sense of the room a little bit. Name or where you're coming from, maybe on the end there.
Hi, I'm Amy Lynn Smith. I'm based in Metro Detroit, and I'm an issue advocacy-based storyteller. And I very much share Annie's philosophy of the importance of when you have to share facts, which in issue advocacy is often critical, that you have to wrap them inside a story. And so that's something I work at every single day. And I would love to hear from the panelists, because I think a lot of the work you're doing is finding innovative ways to do that. So I'd love some fresh inspiration of ways to wrap those facts inside of a story in a way that maybe even feels seamless and makes those facts virtually invisible while still reaching the audience with the information you need to. Thank you.
We're working on a new project now where we're thinking about how to use data visualization inside of VR around issues of structural racism. And I think that project speaks to the point I was making earlier about just how important it is to not just have the facts, but people who understand the complexities of that information, who use it and apply it in very complex ways, along with a storyteller. So we're now working with storytellers who understand emotion and humanity and narrative in ways that I'm not equipped to do, in ways that I understand that same nuance and complexity around the data, and working together from the very beginning. I don't even know what the project is yet. I don't even have a framework, but someone gave me money to do it, so I'm gonna do it. But to me, that is really innovative, to say that we know this issue matters, we know that this platform might be important, who is truly equipped to understand those different components and who can work together. Sometimes people, I think we go either way. I think even with the first project, right, where I have data, but I'm not a storyteller and I'm trying to tell a story, or a storyteller has some data and they're going to try and pull it in and tell the story based on those facts, rather than those people working together from the very beginning. And sometimes facts are not data. Sometimes fact is also nuanced lived experience or complexities of doing the work. And too often we don't have people who are actually doing the work in those communities, or people from those communities at the table with us. Sometimes we're telling other people's stories that are not our own, presuming that we understand fact. And so I think building teams from the very beginning that honor those different perspectives and types of expertise is really important.
This is not a very good answer, unfortunately, but just to kind of talk about the complexity a little bit. So our friend Nani de la Pena, who's known as the godmother of VR, runs Emblematic, has a pretty awesome VR experience about Greenland and climate change. And you can kind of basically speak to scientists and see what their methods are and how they're measuring and get a sense of what climate change looks like, and also get a sense of how we know that. So you could see where, for people who are non-believers in climate change, they're actually seeing it, they're getting data, they're getting information, whatever. So it's kind of, to your point, endeavoring to do that work. The interesting thing is, at least as I recall the research, the experience is so kind of emotionally impactful for people and so intense that they don't tend to remember the data. So they remember what they learned and they trust more, but the data points fly away. And that may be where we are now in VR, that may be isolated for that experience, it could be any number of things, but it is precisely what you're talking about, and it suggests within the VR space where there is a kind of a psychophysiological response, there is complexity, there may be complexity to do that and for us to process it.
Yeah, I love what you said about working with qualitative researchers or quantitative researchers to look at the data to identify what's actually happening, and then can we tell stories that are rooted in that data? And really, if we think about some of the most prestigious stories that are shared in our society, they are stories about the truth and data. There was a study by Karen Jorgenson. I mention her all the time because I love her. And she looked at Pulitzer Prize-winning stories over a 20-year period, and she found all of these were stories about complex issues, war, systems of oppression, science, all of these things, but all of them introduced these ideas through narrative as a way to anchor something that's really complex and hard to wrap your mind around, especially if you're not in that world, through an individual's narrative. And what she also found was that because journalists want to work to remain objective, is that they outsourced the emotion of the story to the character. So if you can find a person whose lived experience reflects the data and amplify their story, that's a way you tell the story about the truth.
All right, let's take another question. So, what's that? We have Varsha. So Varsha might have a question that comes from our overflow room. Is that right?
Yes. So we have an overflow room where all our participants are watching the live stream, and they've been sending us questions on Twitter. So I'm sorry, we'll get there. This is from Marcy Young, who's a professor at Salt Lake City Community College, and she says, question for Ben. Does Do Something work with academic partners nationwide for film, journalism, or creative students to make content? And if so, what value does that expanded voice add to the mission and diverse perspectives that both educate and unite young people? Well, maybe then I am late. I am so late. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yep. I could just yell or this. Thanks for that question. It's I'm really glad that question was asked, because so much of what we do actually is focused on technology and on platform and on data, and we're really excited to start working more within content and doing a lot of what Prentice was talking about, which is amplifying voices of young folks who either have these lived experiences and or who are content creators. I think we do a good job of that sometimes with our member base and definitely with celebrities and influencers. But we're going to be actually launching a web magazine in the next couple months that's specifically going to be for amplifying the voices of young folks and young content creators. So it's a really timely question and definitely something I'm excited to work on.
Great, and actually on those lines, there's a young content creator, Avisel Diaz from Latina in Arabia, who says, as a young creator hoping to create content that focuses on the power storytelling to counter negative stereotypes, is audio or visual media content more effective?
Is that specific? I feel like anyone, yeah, right. Someone else want to take that?
I would say it depends on it just depends. I mean, I don't know. Actually, I wouldn't say one is more effective. I would say that you should tell the story in the medium in which it's powerful for you. And, if depending on what your outcome is, if you're trying to move folks in the civic space and those things like that, all these things need to be layered. But what's most important for the creator is to use the medium that actually tells the story in the way in which they need to tell it.
As a big podcast enthusiast, so just to compare video
With a new podcast.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
True. With Henry Jenkins. For me, you get with audio, even just to build on what Brenda said, there are different sort of parameters. Video has got to be pretty short typically, and video might happen with lots of other things going on a small screen without sound, whereas audio is oftentimes in your ears, and it feels like a voice from the heavens speaking to you. And you can imagine things that activates your brain in different ways. So I'm passionate about audio, and visual is also totally amazing. You can do all kinds of other things. You can show the world in ways that we can't imagine. So I mean, just to build on that, I think it's just really important to be aware of what you're trying to do, the constraints on you, and then choose the medium or the media, because you might do it in different ways at different times using different media and have that transmedia experience. We haven't even got into gaming, which is a whole nother huge opportunity space.
Maybe I will just mention in terms of opportunity space and research, there's this huge hunger, I'm sure a lot of you have seen this too, to try and answer this kind of question. Well, is VR going to be more powerful than film? Is audio more powerful? These questions, they don't go away. Like in every conference I review for, I see another one of these kind of studies where please tell me which one is the... And I think it's both really tempting. We want answers that we're going to keep feeling that temptation to give me the form, or it's what's the best use of social media? What works? But some of the things that I think are most important for kind of especially campaigns and movements are exactly the ones that resist answering those questions in the lab, which is not to say we can't come up with answers. I think the danger is that we will read the answers for campaigns and movements. I don't know if you guys feel this way too, but I think walking this line and how to have a conversation that is about story movements bigger than the answer to that question, almost to resist that question in some way, but still respect where it comes from. We are hungry to try to have answers.
My innovation hat would say, try it out, rapid prototype, do something that's cheap and easy and see what the results are. And just keep trying it out before we make that big investment and decide.
And we haven't even begun to hear, related to your work, Prentice, from our most powerful storytellers. We don't know what platform they would create or what they would do with the platforms because they don't have access to them. So we've heard from a very limited slice of voices, so we should not pretend to have answers to what works and what's best because we have no idea.
Yeah. Excellent. All right, question in the middle. Let's see, do we have a way to, do we have mics that we can pass along? And your name too.
You, me? My question is for Courtney. It's pretty quick. When you are finding people to go through the experience of your virtual reality, where are they coming from? Where do you find these people to go through the experience, and how are you using it? Is it just in the lab setting or some other way?
We just set up on a sidewalk and put up a sign. No, I'm just kidding. We premiered it at the Tribeca Film Festival, which was a little nerve-wracking because before that only 20 people had gone through it, and I didn't really know how it was going to land. And it was really quite compelling. I mean, that's probably a liberal, progressive-leaning environment, although I make no assumptions about who people are. But it was really compelling to see people rushing up to sign up to experience racism, white people in particular. And it's not something, the way I reacted to that was not something I anticipated before that. So since then, we've been going to other festivals and tech events where we have big audiences like that. I'm a psychologist, so we're doing laboratory-based research to assess whether we're actually shifting things like empathy and bias, but more importantly to me, I'm interested in behavior and what we call structural competence. So the ability to frame problems as being rooted in systems and structures and culture and not just some individual person's bias. And then we're also working with organizations who are interested in, say, training their leadership to think differently about these sorts of issues, but really interested in also partnering with museums and schools. I would love to work with a teacher or set of teachers to think about the curriculum they would design around this. I helped design a course in our school called Power, Racism, Oppression, and Privilege. In our incoming class of graduate students, half of them did the VR in addition to taking that class. class, and we're tracking whether they've engaged that material differently and landed at different places as a result of the VR. So we're interested in those sorts of engagements. It's not something that we think makes sense to release on, say, a public platform where you're just at home alone doing it. This is really heavy for most people. It's a pretty emotional experience, and we think you need to help people think through what they just saw and perhaps recontextualize the emotion in data after they come out of the headset, and not just let it sit at "that sucks," but to help them do something with it. And so museums, educational settings, and then organizations where you have some kind of training or initiative in place in addition to the VR, we think are the most powerful spaces to do something like this.
It's interesting you mentioned the things you could do something around it, the programming around it. In games, there's sometimes the discussion of the big G game, which isn't the thing you play, but all the stuff, what the teacher says when you introduce it, the debrief that happens. This is true in museum work too. Like long-term effects come from if the teacher debriefs the experience after you all go to the museum. And I think as we're designing more experiences alongside stories, that we're becoming part of that design of the reflection and the social structure around the story alongside the story. Let's take another question from the audience. Front row here, very easy to pass along the mic.
Hi, I'm Lisette. I'm a DC resident, and I always love bringing it back to where we are here in DC. As you know, we don't have representation in Congress, and even within our own DC council, we're constantly struggling for voter turnout. Like the last election, I think 22% of DC residents voted. We're dealing with gentrification and Black folks being pushed out. And so I'm wondering if you have any advice on how we can use storytelling and platforms to shift and move power here in DC, given all of these challenges. Also in DC, we have a lot of activists and organizers, but folks are mainly focused on national issues. And I think the number of organizers committed to DC and shifting power here is very small. So if you have any advice, I'd love to hear that.
What's your name again? Lisette. Thank you. So I'm a firm believer that storytellers and creatives need to be anchored with a political home. So what we see oftentimes is that, and I think you were talking about this earlier, is that there are storytellers who are telling amazing stories about the world, what's happening, but they're not connected to how we actually move that through politics. Or there's political and social change makers who are trying to change things through logic, but don't have the stories to do it. And I think that part of my advice is that in DC, in any locality, is that in order to leverage the power of artists as a political strategy, you have to get those artists into the political home of the organization in order to tell the stories that move the agenda of the people, in that they're practicing democracy together and they're accountable to a base in which they're going out into the world. So part of what the Midwest Culture Lab does is it builds the cultural programs not in isolation, but in political homes in states in the Midwest. Because we know those artists, for them to be impactful, is not only do they need to create art, they need to be with like OSA, who registered 30,000 voters and turned out, through door knocks and texts over 100,000 people. Like, we're able to do skilled civic engagement, scaled issue advocacy in our state, and the artist goes and brings an additional layer and tactic of bringing the folks in who we won't reach at the doors, who we won't reach in text, but who will be reached through a conversation, through someone they believe in their artistry, and that they also get to tell a bigger story that allows it to push forward your local issue.
I don't know if this is how this works, but I'm going to put on my moderator hat for a second and maybe open the door up actually to you, Benjamin. I know that, not to put you on the spot, but I know that you work locally here in DC and have done a lot around community-based organizing, so maybe you want to speak to this a bit.
Sure. Well, I think the question of local and global is a question obviously a lot of us are thinking about. And we used to think about like local media. Cable TV was like a big thing, and we had policy around that. what is kind of the cable TV with social media? I feel like these are questions that we should all be invested in, especially if you're a national person. And I think like DC to me is one of the most interesting cities for having both the national pressure and like the vacuum that pulls people into doing national organizing when there's really interesting local history issues and really pressing needs as well. So one of the things that I think is a great perspective that we should be looking to is that there are like people who are doing neighborhood sociology, neighborhood organizing, who are also storytellers. And I think that a lot of the storytelling tradition with media has focused on, I'm going to make a piece of media and put it on the airwaves. So we have hidden in our models a broadcast model, a mass media model. And I think that the question of, like, is mass media our only model? Or if it's not mass media, do we have a word for it? Do we have a word for like what the buy local kind of version of media is, where we're trying to support the local and insist on the local as something that's a little bit separate? When do we want to question that success is I got 10 million people to see my movie? Maybe 10 million people means that you made the wrong kind of movie because it wasn't a local thing. So I think that these are, I just want to affirm the question in some ways and think that it's not one that we have one answer to, but I think that it's a question I want to have asked more often.
And some of my colleagues at USC, David Craig in particular, working on this concept of social media entertainment and sort of this idea that it's not creators who are making things in a vacuum and sending it out there, but they are absolutely creating ideas and crafting and sharing them very much in collaboration with their community. And they're each extracting different kinds of benefits from it, but it is fundamentally a co-creation process. And I think that has all sorts of benefits individually in terms of the community, that co-creation, participation, and so on, in making it more rooted. And we see that with, for instance, with the census work we're doing, you kind of have broad and wide influencers, and then you have kind of more narrow and deep. And those are both valuable in different ways, and then you can see where the ecosystem of them together can really kind of net both things that are rooted in place and in community and reality and lived experience, but also get amplified in certain moments in ways that have broader impact beyond that community. And I think understanding those dynamics and thinking about how we work together to amplify each other's ideas, to push back and challenge them, but to engage them across these different platforms, there's real power there.
All right, question over here. And say your name if you don't mind.
Hi, my name is Erica Johnson. I'm actually a student here, a graduate student at American University. And yeah, somebody was. My project is framing social movements in the media, having that experience of going down to the border and helping out at border rights issues, et cetera. But my question is, it's not that people have a lack of ideas, it's finding mentors and people who support those ideas. So in coming up with your projects, how did you find people who supported your ideas? And then how did you push those ideas forward if you didn't find anybody? Were there any particular mentors that played a strong role in coming up with what you're doing now?
Well, our project, I was like, we shouldn't do that. I'm risk averse when it comes to convening, but Ann Cristiano, who's here, is the director of the center, and she said, we have this opportunity to use this funding to ask a question that's never been asked before. So I think it's surrounding yourself with people who can think in ways that you can't is really important. And as everyone else has said on the stage, it's really important to have people on your team who are really good at their thing and that thing, and then you work collectively to create something you wish existed. So I guess the question is, how do you start building something? Surround yourself with people who also want to see the world that you do, and let them make the thing that they know how to make, and be open and iterate and see where it lands. And no matter what comes out, it's going to be important. It's going to be good because you have created something that's not there.
I think sometimes when we are tackling issues that we're so deeply connected to that we know are important, that we believe other people should be into it just because we think it's important, or that they should just feel some sense of responsibility because it's an important issue. And I think sometimes that works, and sometimes the person you're trying to engage won't get that, and that's not the way to talk about it or represent the particular thing that you're trying to do. So I've had to learn and take more responsibility for crafting my own story about the work I'm doing using the words out of my mouth. Who am I talking to? What do they need to hear to understand that they are connected to this just as much as I am, and that this has implications for them as well? And that's my responsibility. That's my job. I can't just rely on someone having a bleeding heart and understanding that this matters. And so finding mentors who are directly grounded in the work that you're trying to do, but also mentors who don't realize that they're important to what you're doing, and you effectively conveying to them why they need to be on board.
I'd just like to connect those two great comments. I mean, the hard work, I mean, anyone in this room is engaging at the kind of bleeding edge of your practice space. And that's hard for individuals, and it's hard for organizations. It's hard for it's hard for everybody. And we talk a lot about hard work, and like there's all these metaphors of like heavy lifting and nose to the grindstone that tend to be physical. Like staying up late is pretty easy. Not knowing the answer or whether what you're doing is the right thing, that's really hard. That's like emotionally hard in your gut, and caring, as many people do, really deeply about the work they're doing and feeling an obligation to make a difference, that is emotionally really difficult, right? So my first observation is like, you gotta recognize that, and it has self-care implications, whatever, but it means do not do it alone, because doing it alone is doubly hard. And now what alone means could be any number of different things, whether that's a mentorship, whether that's team, whether that's just people that you talk to regularly, your family or whatever. You need to find ways to kind of support yourself, because you're going into uncharted territory. If you're at a university, invariably, whether you're faculty or whether you're a student, you're going to push the boundaries. There's not going to be a program for you at the university that tells you what you need to know. You need to roll your own, right? You're making up your own thing. And I think coming back to what Courtney's just said is like, so you need to be clear on what your thing is, and you need to craft and recraft and understand that, listen to feedback, and continue to be in a loop until you're actually finding the people you need on that journey. But it is not easy, right? Like you have to take responsibility to assemble that. You cannot go to a store and just like, yeah, I'll take one of those on Amazon. That's not going to happen. So first thing is to like be aware of that going in.
I want to add one quick thing on the platform side of it too, especially from the university context, which is like our computer science students, for the most part, have never been asked to participate on a social change project. This is kind of like the civic question, like why do most people not do civic stuff? Nobody's asked them. And I think on our platform and tech and modeling side, we still are not making the ask. And that's partly because it's hard enough to go into to not feel like you're supported and have somebody who's like emotionally supporting you, but to go into a totally different disciplinary space. How do you even break into a computer science classroom? Where is that opening? So those of us that are at universities, I think, have to be doing a lot better job of creating those spaces to cross disciplines, not just saying, I'm interested in interdisciplinary stuff, but like our courses are not mixing the students. They're I think for the most part, largely isolated. And I think that's a really interesting challenge for the platform and storyteller people to connect in some way. Let's do another question from the audience, right here in the middle.
Thank you. I think this is a wonderful panel, and I want to thank CMSI for this event. I'm Michonne Boston. I work as an engagement consultant here in Washington, D.C., occasional journalist and playwright. I have a question about public health, and how does that affect your work, or are you monitoring it? Because there are some public health benefits to taking a step when you are feeling isolated, when you are feeling out of control, when you feel you don't matter. And there are also historic incidents that have happened in communities that still affect the public health of those communities. How do we connect that with our civic storytelling and our impact goals?
So I have a separate line of research where I'm looking at exposure to media and how it triggers stress responses. So as people consume racist media that's either blatant or very subtle, does it trigger physiological stress responses that might have implications for health down the line? The short answer is yes. And not just for the people who are being targeted in the content, but also people who are represented as the opposite side of those experiences. So I'm observing that for both whites and blacks. And part of why that's been so important for me is that there's not a lot of work on what the implications of media are for health. There's a lot of work around communication, around smoking and obesity, and how does that shift your health behaviors, but how does the consumption of it actually contribute potentially to cardiovascular disease? So I think that's an important area where there's more work that's needed. With the VR work, that's not in the health space explicitly for me yet, but what we found, of course, is when we put white and black people through that experience, we see very different reactions, as we might imagine. Initially, we thought it was just very triggering and damaging. So I had a black man almost take the headset off during the police scene. He later told me that he couldn't hear the instructions and he was afraid about what would happen if he didn't follow the instructions while in the piece. But since then, in a broader community sample, we're running a pilot sample with blacks, we're also seeing people tell us that they don't talk and think about these issues as much as we do necessarily in academic spaces or in activist spaces, and they felt validated to see this represented. So I think there's some, for me, in terms of my specific space, there's some really interesting implications that I'm still trying to grapple with, and also trying to think about leveraging media on the positive side to have that kind of positive influence and not just think about the negative health consequences, but how can media be healing and restorative, and not just speaking specifically to white people, which is what I'm doing right now, but how might you use some of those same tools to heal and restore the communities that have been so damaged by the very same media that we're trying to leverage.
Just one also specific example from USC, where colleagues are working on working with folks, with veterans with PTSD, dealing with a virtual counselor and having really remarkable results for things that they wouldn't say to a human, they're somehow comfortable saying to a robot. So I think there are all kinds of interesting things out there. And there's complexities in there too, but.
Great, all right, let's take another question here.
Thank you. Okay. So I'm Samina S, and I'm a journalist working with the Voice of America Language Service here in Washington, D.C. My question is, like, most of the time whenever we see the storytellers or their projects, so they are only covering one angle of a story. And these the storytelling projects, they are most of the time on the social media, so the social media doesn't give you that much space to put everything in your story. For example, Instagram, which only gives you less than 1 minute to tell your story or post it. So how we can cover a story with every angle which should be there and which should convey a complete story, not a one-sided story. Like, you work on the racism, but racism is not that easy to understand. Racism also has so many other angles which needs to be understood. It's not only someone is, like someone remarks, racist remarks, or someone is telling you something. It's also, behind it, also there is an environment where the kids grows and they take the influence from that environment, and also the government policies. So how to cover a balance, how to tell a balanced story in a shortest possible time. Thank you.
Well, I would say that depending on who the audience is, you might have to do more scene setting than not. If you're writing a story for an audience that knows the context and the history, you don't have to include every single detail. They don't have to know everything you know to care as much as you care. So if you're telling a story to a choir, you can leave out some of those details. If you're trying to build understanding in a community, then you're going to want to find a story that helps illustrate systemic factors that are creating a particular phenomena. So if you wanted to talk about a health problem or something related to the social determinants of health, you might find a story of a character who is interacting with those systems. That is the setting in which they're having to make decisions and live their lives. And as we take the perspective of the character, we come to deeply understand these things that are big and abstract, and you need a PhD to really get deep into the nuances of them. And so I would say it depends on who you're talking to, and when possible, tell stories that allow us to experience the thing that seems really big and complex. I like the example of the story of Peggy from Mad Men, where it's a really great example of how you help some audiences imagine what it's like to experience gender discrimination in the workplace, rather than just simply saying, In the 1950s and 60s, there was gender discrimination in the workplace. For people who've experienced that, we'd say, I know what that feels like. And for people who don't, they'd be like, I wonder what that feels like. And they might insert their assumptions or their beliefs. But because we're brought into the story through her character, we take her perspective, we watch as she interacts with her coworkers, we leave the story with a deeper understanding of what that sort of discrimination looks like. And when we're faced with a question around discrimination or gender disparities, we have an anecdote or a reference point going forward.
I just want to build on that. So my colleagues at Wise Entertainment, which made the Hulu show East Los High for a bunch of years, have really interesting kind of explicitly transmedia approaches where you have kind of a typical teen melodrama TV show set in a Latinx high school in LA, and then in dealing with real world issues and dancing and kissing, whatever, all the kinds of things, and teen pregnancy and the things that they had kind of researched and understood from experts were happening in those communities and storylines written around them. But they break the third wall, right? They come out into your world in character, Facebook Live or Twitter moments, also out of character, talking with the actor, in other spaces, online and offline, in ways that allow you to kind of pull on the threads that you want to pull on and go deeper. And so there's kind of breadcrumbs to more, and you can kind of get in there as deep as you want. And they, claim pretty substantial role in reduction in teen pregnancies as a result of the work that they did. So I think there's a lot of different ways that you can allow people through curiosity to round out their understanding of the story.
A provocation on that on the platform side is we're tempted to answer with, let's show multiple sides of the story. I feel like this is a refrain in journalism all the time. And part of me is like on the platform side, I feel like what you hint at is forget about showing another side of the story, show them another platform that gives them another space to talk about it for longer. I think the hidden side of this is like we show a movie, but then we ask people to discuss in person. We've in some ways switched platforms to do that. And I think as long as we recognize that that was a platform shift, we can do that kind of thing with media too. Like where do you go from Twitter or where do you go from your platform? I maybe can turn that as a question to you all. When do you cross platforms, or how are you looking to cross to something like the big evil Facebook or what have you? When do we drop into those spaces and then pull people into other spaces?
The platform shift for us is from the online engagement or the site-based, we call it C-space, an art engagement into a community organizing meeting. So part of it is that we want to bring them into the story in one of many stories where we're intentionally telling a lot of different stories because the deeper level is the actual shift of the dialogue. Rather, if it's a site-based, for example, we had an art crawl where we had a conversation about a lot of different stories. There was probably at least 30 different stories through the art and art crawl. And then we were then able to then have a facilitated conversation with youth about the election. And then we are then having a conversation with voter guides that are again mailed out to them and then text. So all those are all a continuation of engagement that's continuing a deeper level of conversation on each level. So we actually are mirroring that engagement on every platform in which we switch, but we're trying to actually start the engagement from an artistic place so they get the emotional tug that brings them into the work so that they can actually figure out how that emotional thing that brought them joy is actually political. And how do they move through that engagement through multiple tactics and platform shifts.
Let's take one more question from the audience over here.
My name is Anna Gerard, and I'm a filmmaker here. I've been here a long time. And I think the main thing I was interested in talking to Ben, I think it is, on voting rights. I make films, but I also have been working with voting rights issues in North Carolina and elsewhere, and how one can not merely bring folks in to vote, but to engage them to deal with the gerrymandering and other things. And also I've also worked on a film on DC's lack of voting rights. And that's one place where truly engaging people so they're active, they're not just passive. And it was so fascinating what you're doing, which is pulling together science and art and platforms and storytelling, and what ideas do you have in terms of engaging young people or engaging people in challenging the nefarious actors and whatnot who are undermining the right to vote.
Thanks so much for your question. I think one of the interesting shifts, and I'm upset that I can't remember who was saying this or the publication I read it, but they were talking about how one of the things we saw in the 2018 election is engaging people. There are previously things that felt too abstract or too amorphous to engage folks around, and how in 2018 we were actually able to help people understand those things and engage around them. So for young folks, something like voter registration, voter suppression, voting rights, the voting process, all these things, they feel not only foreign, but they feel amorphous. And so the fact that we were able to see so many different ways of engaging young folks around voter registration and voter turnout nationwide, I think proves a lot of things, but one of the things is that it's taking something that feels foreign and amorphous and actually turns education into motivation. And I think that that's something that can be applied to something like gerrymandering, to these systemic issues, things like voting rights and voting suppression, and connecting, as a bunch of folks have talked about, the historical issues and systemic issues that have perpetuated those things. And so I think the more that we can take these high-level things and help young folks apply them to their lives through platforms and stories to make them feel personal and immediate and urgent, I think we've proven that there's actual that we can see results, and that's actually possible. Whereas in previous generations, maybe we thought that wasn't possible.
I think, let's see. On that note, there's a bunch more hands that have come up at different times. I hope that they'll be able to ask them at other places in this conference, but also at lunch and beyond to the people here. I think that the question of how platform and story goes together, I think we want to lead with story a lot in this space. This is often where a lot of us are coming from. But this hopefully I loved hearing where everyone took this in terms of the connections back to platform and action and complexity.